We are honored to introduce our keynote speakers for the International Conference on Emerging Media Paradigms 2020. Dr. Arvind Singhal is the Samuel Shirley and Edna Holt Masterson Professor and Director of Social Justice Initiative at the University of Texas, El Paso, and has been appointed as the William J. Clinton Distinguished Fellow, Clinton School of Public Service, University of Arkansas. I request, sir, to deliver the keynote address.
So let me begin by thanking the distinguished cadre of guests as well as hosts. You may have noticed when I lit the lamp, my hand was shaking, which means I'm probably nervous, and that is a good thing. Also, of course, when you are given a shawl, it is a gesture of tremendous warmth. Of course, in the Delhi winter, you probably need it at this time. So I want to begin with a story, and then I'm going to come be at your level. One of the beautiful stories of Abraham Lincoln is when he was asked by a soldier, "Mr. President, you're tall, how tall are you?" Lincoln's response, without batting an eyelid, was, "Son, like you, tall enough that my feet reach the ground." So Lincoln was not responding by saying that his height was 6 feet 4.5 inches. Even though he was the president, even though he was the commander-in-chief, even though he was a tall man, his response to a simple question was, "I am tall enough that my feet reach the ground." So may I have your permission to be on the ground? Now I feel at home. So I'm going to be having a dialogue with you about what we call transmedia storytelling. And I'll talk to you about the power of transmedia storytelling. And if you want a visual representation of transmedia storytelling, it's on the screen. A lot of connected ideas, channels, platforms, spaces, which come together in some coordinated way. And I'm going to stay in the realm of Khayali Dunya, narrative fiction. I know we've had representatives who've talked about news. Kate was talking about how even news is about stories we tell, but I'm going to restrict myself to the notion of narrative fiction, literature, if you may, or things that are done in order to tell stories that engage people, include them, perhaps encourage them to participate and do something with them. Is that okay? ठीक है? चलेगा? Since this conference is on narratology and emerging media paradigms, I had to make some, I had to make some narratological choices, right? How should I talk to you? And I decided, since I found a picture of Nelson Mandela doing Namaste, that I would use a framework that he used in addressing a large crowd of South Africans after he walked out of prison. So Mandela said, "We owe it to our ancestors who have brought us here. We owe it to our children who will take us there. and we also owe it to ourselves because we connect our ancestors with our children. So that's the framework that I'm going to use to talk about transmedia storytelling and narrative. If this would work, yeah. We owe it to our, yes, you got it, okay. So now let's talk about we owe it to our ancestors. Ready? Now there's a little quiz built in, and I'd encourage you to also participate in reading the lines as they come along. Will you do that? Because transmedia storytelling is about engagement. It's about invitation. Yeah? Ready? Once upon a... If I can get this clicker to cooperate. Please. Once upon a time, as literacy rose and printing technology advanced, this is about 175 or 180 years ago. Anybody knows what I'm going to be talking about? Okay, I'll give you a hint. Anybody who recognizes this person? Charles Dickens. Now, why, when we talk about we owe it to our ancestors, I could have talked about several people, but it's important that I talk about Charles Dickens. Because one of the things which Dickens did, starting in 1837, when he wrote the Pickwick Papers, which was a novel which was a serialized novel, which was a tremendous hit, was he would take his writing and offer it to people over a long period of time in weekly or monthly installments. So in many ways, he was the founder of what we know as episodic, serialized offering of literature. You know about dharavahiks, you know about serials, but Dickens is the person who initiated it all over a 40-year period with tremendous success. So let's talk about Dickens a little. I think I would even call him, you can call other people too, but in many ways, in hindsight, the father of what we know as narrative fandom. How do you get people hooked to a certain piece of literature that comes to you in installments so that you wait for aage kya hoga? What's coming next? So he was the one who serialized narrative fiction, and it was important to serialize in newspapers or in periodicals because now, as opposed to people buying an expensive bounded book through a newspaper at low cost, the masses could be invited and engaged in the consumption of the story. You get the idea? So it's not a class affair, but it is a mass affair. And with rising rates of literacy, with the economics of distribution becoming in line, and with the advances in printing technology, this became possible. The serialized fiction, fundamentally, from a theoretical point of view, began to change our understanding of what we mean by text. क्या शुरू होता है, क्या खत्म होता है, क्या जुड़ता है, or intertextuality. How do you connect one piece with the other? And it led to all these devices. What should be the rhythm? of a certain episode? How should it end? Cliffhanger. Hook, as we know it, so that you tune in, so that you wait for a week, so that now you are talking with others about kya hoga aage, what is going to happen. And Dickens, in many ways, was a precursor to our notion of what we know as TRPs. And you're saying, really, how? Because as opposed to a publisher investing all their money in the creation of a book and printing lots of copies and having them in their warehouse, the way a certain story was being accepted would give them an idea about the potentiality of that book. This is all ratings, no? Feedback mechanisms. And then when you put the book together after it was serialized, then you had a book in hand, which meant you could do your binge watching, right? Or binge reading. So all these concepts which you may relate to now, in some ways we owe it to some of our ancestors. And Dickens is just one of them. Now in other countries you had Alexandre Dumas in France, The Count of Monte Cristo. That was also serialized over 139 periodicals. In the US, you had Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was also serialized over 90 serialized publications. And that's the reason why these books in some ways have become legendary, because these are books that have really never gone out of print. These are books that have in some ways created an aura around these masterful authors. Even the Sherlock Holmes, are there people who've read Sherlock Holmes? So Arthur Conan Doyle was the one who serialized, and you can imagine with Sherlock Holmes, the whodunit kept people going. So where we are today with narrative fiction, in many ways, the ancestry goes back to the likes of Dickens and others. So the first novel which was serialized was Pickwick Papers. This is around the same time that Queen Victoria came to power, so it's known as the Victorian era. And guess what? Over a period of time, Charles Dickens began to publish his own periodical. This would be like having your own streaming service. And that was called, appropriately, All the Year Around. And so he used All the Year Round in this December 1, 1860 edition to have a serialized episode of Great Expectations. So, in order to proceed with where we are now, I want to take you, and this is a quiz again. Let's see if you get this one, and see if you can read along with me. Once upon a time, क्या? Swadeshi movement, non-cooperation, nahi, salt march, salt satyagrah, Dandi march. And it inspired social movements globally. So if Charles Dickens is the father of fandom, Mahatma Gandhi is the guru of analog campaign design. Pehle, think about the narrative frame. He says salt. We are going to take on the British government on the basis of salt. Why? Because the British in India tax salt. They taxed a whole host of other things, but they also tax salt. Furthermore, not only was salt taxed, but there was complete British monopoly on the production, processing, and selling of salt. Gandhi's argument, you know, he was a lawyer, to Lord Irwin was salt is something that everybody needs. In fact, is one thing that the poor need more than the rich. And so his legal argument was, Lord Irwin, I request you to repeal the tax on salt because by taxing salt, you place a differential burden on those who are the poorest of the poor. And if not, then I shall walk to Dandi from his Sabarmati ashram, 240 miles, to make my own salt because salt exists freely in nature and I should claim it as my right. And the whole narrative was, this is a battle of right against might. This is an exemplary example of narrative persuasion at multiple levels, because as he walked the 240 miles with his followers, do you think he got there in a day? 240 days. He invited journalists. He was doing his own writings. He invited newsreel makers from all over the world. So you can imagine this is an unfolding soap opera on a grand scale for 24 days. Because at the end of the first day, they report. Here's a brown man in a loincloth walking. Why is he walking? Oh, he's walking because the British tax salt in India. Really? The British tax salt in India? Oh yeah, they do. And also Indians cannot. You get the idea? Today, at the end of the first day, 11,340 people marched with Gandhi. Some for short distances. Let's see what the number will be tomorrow. Debates about Gandhi's march, because the newspaper reporters from the London Times and the Washington Post are sending their feeds back. So debates are being held in the US Congress during FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's. You know, why are the British doing this? Oh yeah, well, they used to tax tea when America was a colony of the British, and you know it was Indian tea thrown in Boston tea, in Boston Harbor, which led to, you can say, a significant event, yeah? Deja vu in some ways. So the route, as you know, was very carefully charted. 200, you know, where would they sleep? Where would they rest? Where would they pray? Several million charkhas were constantly running as Gandhi and his followers walked. Prayer meetings. People resigning from, you know, those who were village leaders who were in the payroll of the British were resigning, and so on and so forth. So anyway, you get the idea? We owe it to our ancestors. You have the Guru of Fandom, serialized episodes, TRPs and binge watching, masses as opposed to classes. And you have Gandhi, a person who designs a campaign that influences the likes of, well, Bhave here in India, or Martin Luther King Jr. in the US, or Cesar Chavez in the part of the world that I live in, and so on. Okay. Should we talk about we owe it to ourselves a little? So, as some of you know, in my positionality as a student of narrative fiction, and I've done a lot of work, well, I've done some work with a lot of collaborators, many of whom are here, in the area of what we've come to know as entertainment education, using narratives, but with a social purpose. How can you design high-quality, engaging, inclusive programs which not only deliver ratings, that's critical, but also at the same time create the conditions for conversations about difficult issues to happen. And with the help of others, I've helped document some of these. Publications are on the screen. And I want to talk to you very briefly about 3 little projects, or maybe 2, I don't know how many slides I have on those, but one project that I was involved in assessing 25 years after it was broadcast was a project in Peru called Simplemente Maria, which basically means simply Mary. It was the story of a migrant girl, sort of a Cinderella story. We recognize that narrative theme of Cinderella. She came from the highlands, she was a maid, and then she's very good with a Singer sewing machine. She likes to enroll in an adult literacy classes after her householding duties are over. And as this is a Cinderella, rags to riches story, so as the episodes go on, she becomes a very successful woman, a fashion designer, in fact. Now, a few things happened in Peru which were unexpected. Well, the sales of Singer sewing machines began to go through the roof. Singer Sewing Company, they're no fools. They buy advertising time on Simplemente Maria when it's broadcast in many other countries. And, the profits go up even more. I have visited the woman who played Maria, Sabi Kamilich, in her home in Mexico. And right in the center of her living room is a sewing machine in a display trophy. And I said, Sabi, and she said, yeah, it's of gold. And it was a little token that the Singer Sewing Company had given in appreciation for what she had done to sell Singer sewing machines, but most importantly, as a result of Simplemente Maria, the number of enrollments of migrant women in adult literacy classes began to grow through the roof. The number of women who wanted to enroll in sewing classes and other vocational activities began to go through the roof. And of course, this is a soap opera, so there's got to be romance, right? So you can see that Maria is falling in love with her adult literacy teacher, who's a very handsome man who also loves Maria, but of course is shy of saying so, and so is Maria because he's a teacher. So the audience members sit in front of their TV sets and say, please, Maria, you can tell Esteban that you have good feelings for him. And the men folk would tell Maestro, Maestro, come on, make your move. She'll be okay with it, but it doesn't happen. And the Maestro becomes her business manager because she now is a fashion designer. But then finally, when Maestro's mother puts a little pressure and says, now I think I wouldn't be able to bounce little grandchildren on my knees, Maestro succumbs and pops the question. So at age 45, and this is what they look like, their marriage is announced. And this is the marriage of the century in Peru. This is an image from the cover page of the top newspaper, which I personally dug out. This came out in 1970, that Maria finally is going to, and people got word of where this wedding scene was going to be filmed. And this is what the image looked like, which was also on the top page, outside this church, because 10,000 people dressed in their best suits with flowers running out of flower shops, stood there with gifts in arms for Maria in Estroban, and there are reports that when in the fictionalized shooting, when Maria said, "I do," there were at least a dozen, I'm told, women who fainted because they were overcome by the gravity of the resolution that finally. So these are not regular programs. They are highly popular, engaging, including programs, and we learn a lot about narrative engagement and narrative persuasion by studying these kinds of programs. What makes it possible for people to develop such interpersonal relationships with the characters that you speak to them as if they're listening to you? Like, "Maestro, make your move," and so on. I was involved in studying Hum Log. It was part of my doctoral dissertation. Some of you know this story. It's the Soul City story. I worked very closely in South Africa with people who were addressing, for this particular series on domestic violence, and our research had shown that there were three little narratives that were at play. Men felt they were in control when they were in the privacy of their home. Women felt vulnerable in the sanctity and safety of their home, because this is domestic violence. We look at home as a place where you traditionally look for safety. But here, there, safety was being violated in that space. And we also found that neighbors, even though they knew what was going on, were not intervening, because this is a private matter between husband and wife. So as the storyline unfolded, and this was a multimedia project on radio, there were serialized newspapers, television, and a whole host of other activities, advocacy activities, the passage of the Domestic Violence Act, telephone hotlines. In one of the episodes, when the man is about to beat his partner, the neighbors come out of their homes with their pots and pans. And they stand outside the abuser's home and they bang their pots and pans. Now, this behavior was not known in South African society, in culture. But because this was such a popular program and it had many multimedia avatars, we began to see, as we did research on it, that people began to come out of their homes to bang their pots and pans to address the issue of domestic violence. Pots and pans are available in every home, and there are neighbors who know what's going on. And so that's the joy of being involved in narrative fiction, that you can take a story to a place where it has not been to show a reality which does not exist but then exists now. And for it to be commercially viable, Soul City was the #2 rated show in South Africa, and for it to be socially responsible is the call that you can have a narrative of commercial and social responsibility working together. We owe it to our children. How much time do I have? 1 minute, 2, 3?
So another 2 minutes.
Another 2 minutes, okay.
You can extend it by another 2 minutes because it's so interesting.
No need, no need, no need. Because I can send you this and I can send you links. So we owe it to our ancestors, we owe it to us, we owe it to our children. And I'll just say this. You know, many of you can perhaps identify what is happening today is we've gone from the big screen to the small screen. And this is as a result of miniaturization, digitization, and convergence of media, technology, and elements. Your smartphone is more than, well, it's smart. And it's simply a phone, but it's smart. Yeah? So it's my small screen. I decide what I need to watch and when. I consume, and as our colleagues were saying, I produce and I participate. My choices are influenced by my network of influencers and friends. So the world that we are living in, the world that our children are living in today is a world where you're looking at fragmented media markets with choice-laden menus, where you have 1 million menus to choose from. And so you also need to draw upon Dickens and draw upon Gandhi to create what we call transmedia storytelling experiences. We were able to do that. There's a wonderful example that I was associated with in Hollywood, which I think is an exemplary initiative. It's called East Los High. I can tell you more about East Los High. It was a web series delivered to Latino teenagers living in the US. We have published highly on this. So if you're interested, you can wait for my email address and write to me. I can send you. So this is a good way of using this time. And this was a program that was top rated, won all kinds of awards. Transmedia engagement through different distributed channels and platforms increased the engagement and led to higher and more significant cognitive, affective, and behavioral effects. In conclusion, we have come far. We should never forget that. But all of you, the young people, will take us further. Yeah? Thank you. You can write to me. A soap opera should always end with "to be continued," no? So for continued conversation.
Standing ovation.
Yeah, thank you.
Give him a standing ovation. We'll be sharing with you his email ID, his contact, and all the links which we will publicize quite widely.